Hello everybody! So welcome to your first video for Chapter 4. We are going to be learning how to write linear equations in this chapter. So we're going to be writing our own equations. And in this chapter, we're going to learn a bunch of different ways to do that. Today, we are going to learn just specifically slope-intercept form. Now, if you recognize that name, it's because we actually learned about slope-intercept form in a previous chapter. So, let's review really quick. First, let's review slope. When we learned about slope, we said slope is the ratio of rise over run. We also said there's a formula we can use to find the slope. Our formula is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So using those two ideas, let's look at a couple examples. If I say find the slope of the line that goes through these 2 points, because there are 2 points, I'm going to use my formula. y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Now in these points, we call the first point point number 1. So we've got x1, y1. And we call the second point point number 2. So we've got x2, y2. If we just match up those numbers and plug them into the formula, we get 0 minus, and y1 would be negative 1, divided by x2 would be 4, minus x1 would be 2. So you can see they just kind of match up. And if we simplify this, 2 negatives make a positive, so we get 1 divided by 2, which means our slope would be 1/2. Now when we learned about slope, we also said you don't always have to use the formula. Sometimes you can just use rise over run, and that would be when you have a graph. So I'm going to start at the lower point here, and I'm going to rise 2 spaces. So the number 2 would go on the top of my fraction. Then I'm going to run and go sideways 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces. And that's going to be a negative 5 because I'm going to the left. At the end here, if it was possible, I would reduce my ratio. But since 2 and 5 don't reduce, that's my final answer. Now the reason we're reviewing this is because today slope is going to be one piece of the kind of equation we are writing. Today we are going to be writing equations in slope-intercept form. You may remember from the previous chapter that slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. In this kind of equation, the m is always the slope. And the b is always the y-intercept. An example of the way that your answers will look in this section is this. Y equals 1/2 x minus 7. This is how your answers should look when you try the problems today. So let's give this a shot. The first type of problem is write a rule. When it says write a rule, that's the same thing as look for a pattern. So we're going to look at this table. We are going to try to come up with the pattern so that when I plug 0 into my equation, the output is 2. When I plug in 1, the output is 3. When I plug in 4, the output is 6. When I plug in 6, the output is 8. And when I plug in 10, the output is 12. The pattern here is that the y values are always equal to the x values plus 2. I like to say that the pattern is that we are adding 2. So here's how we would write the equation. Y equals x plus 2. Now you'll notice this final answer, y equals x plus 2, looks like a slope-intercept form of an equation, y equals mx plus b. Take a look at the next table and see if you can find a pattern. When I plug in 1, I get 0. When I plug in 2, I get 1. When I plug in 4, I get 3. When I plug in 7, I get 6. And when I plug in 9, I get 8. My pattern that I'm noticing is that all of the y values are equal to the x values minus 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. 2 minus 1 is 1. 4 minus 1 is 3. Again, you'll notice that this equation is slope-intercept form. All of our answers should look that way today. Take a look at problems 3 and 4. In problems 3 and 4, the directions specifically say, write the equations in slope-intercept form, which is my clue that all of my answers should look like this. Y equals mx plus b. Now in problem 3, it specifically says the slope is -2 and the y-intercept is 5. So when I write my equation, slope is always the m, so that would go first. -2, x is always next, and my b, my y-intercept, would be a positive 5. So I just kind of build an equation with those two numbers. Let's take a look at problem 4 and do that one more time. If my slope is 4 and my y-intercept is -3, so this would be my b, and this would be my m. Then y equals 4x, and then the b, so -3. All right, on to the next page. Finding the equation of a line from a graph. Now that we know how to write the equation of a line, we're going to have to be able to write the equation of a line from a graph when I give you a picture as well. Since we're going to be using slope-intercept form, there are going to be two pieces of information that I need to know in order to write this equation. I am going to need to figure out the m and the b. Now the m is the slope. Since I have a picture here, I'm just going to do rise over run. So rise to, run, I would go left 5 spaces, so my answer would be -5. The b would be the y-intercept. So I'm going to look at the y-axis and find the place where the graph crosses the y-axis, which in this problem would be the number 3. Finally, I would put them all together and I would make an equation. Y equals 2 divided by -5x plus 3. I'm just taking the m that I calculated and I'm putting it here, and I'm taking the 3 that I calculated and I'm putting it here. All right, let's try this a few more times. So number 5, the first thing I need to figure out is the slope. I would rise to, run left 5, so -5. My y-intercept would be 3. So my equation would be y equals 2 divided by -5x plus 3. In number 6, my slope would be rise 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Run 3. Now I'm going up and I'm going to the right, so they're both positive. And my y-intercept would be -2. So I would get y equals 5 divided by 3x minus 2. Finally, the last thing we need to talk about today is writing equations of vertical and horizontal lines. You may remember before when we talked about vertical and horizontal lines, we had a magic word. We said the magic word was vux hoi. So to review, the V stands for vertical lines, And the x stands for x equals a number in the equation, and the u stands for an undefined slope. H stands for horizontal lines. O stands for a zero slope. And y stands for y equals a number in the equation. So when I want to write the equation of a line, and I see that it's a vertical or a horizontal line, I am not going to use y equals mx plus b anymore. I am going to use Vuxhoy. Let's look at the first example. The first example here is a horizontal line. So I would write down Hoy. If my line is horizontal, I know that my equation will use y equals. Now the number is 1, 2, 3, so that's my y equals. If I see a vertical line, like in number 2, I'm going to write down Vux. I know a V, a vertical line, uses x in the equation. So I would write down x equals, and then I would fill in the number 3. Okay, that's it for the notes today. We are done. I will see everybody tomorrow.